Good morning and welcome to LDF's webinar. We've been doing this a few times a year, creating an opportunity for a conversation with you, some of our supporters, and those folks who are really interested in the work of the Legal Defense Fund and what we're doing. And the response has been so terrific and so positive that we decided to do another one. And I'm really thrilled that today we are joined by Keli Goff, for whom I'm a great fan. She is special correspondent for TheRoot.com. She is a writer for the Daily Beast, and just recently she was named an emerging playwright by the Public Theater, which is no one knew she was a playwright, but she is a playwright, and she's been working at the Public Theater, and it's fantastic. And if you haven't read Keli's work, she really is an incisive and very provocative columnist who writes about race and civil rights. And I asked if she would join us today for this conversation, and she agreed. And so I hope that you'll enjoy about 30 minutes of conversation, and hopefully we'll have time at the end for some of your questions as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Keli.
Thanks so much, Sherrilyn.
Thank you.
And happy Valentine's Day.
Oh, same to you.
I can't think of a better way to spend it than talking about an issue that we both love and we both care a great deal about, which is civil rights. I'm a huge admirer of the work of LDF, and Thurgood Marshall in particular is one of my lifetime heroes. And so this is an honor and a privilege to be here. And you know this already. It's a mutual admiration society. I'm a huge fan of yours, and I think you probably figured that out by the stalking notes I occasionally send you about great things I see you say on television or I see you write. And in particular, you wrote something recently for The Root, which is the site that I'm a correspondent for, and it was actually one of my favorite pieces on civil rights, and particularly media coverage of civil rights issues that I've read in a really long time. If you were to go strictly by media coverage, you would probably think that deciphering the race of Santa Claus is the most important civil rights issue of our time, if you were to go strictly by media coverage. And you wrote kind of a piece about that, about distinguishing between civil rights issues that we talk a lot about and civil rights issues we should actually be doing a lot about. So here we are 60 years after the landmark Brown v. Board of Education case. And so I wanted to start by asking you, if you had to pick the top 3 civil rights issues today that matter here in America, what would they be and why?
Well, you know, I wrote the piece that you're referring to while we all seem to be gripped in this conversation about the remarks made by a man named Phil Robertson, who stars on a reality show called Duck Dynasty. And I was kind of overwhelmed with how deep the conversation got. And actually earlier in the last year, we'd had kind of the same engagement with the issue over Paula Dean's comments that she referred to in a deposition. And you're right, there was the question about Black Santa. And while all of these issues are amusing and interesting to talk about, I think, for a minute, I was concerned about the amount of airplay they were getting, and there was a way in which I thought they were standing in for real civil rights issues. And that, I think, is dangerous because we happen to be in a moment in this country when we really are facing some very critically important civil rights issues that we should be engaged with. And so your question, you know, I think is an important one. You're right. This year is the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, and you know, obviously for LDF, which litigated the Brown case, it's a year in which we commemorate the decision, which I think is important. It's important to commemorate history, to commemorate the strategic brilliance of the men who planned and organized Brown and women who worked on the case. And I think it's important to really give Brown its due, right, as a decision that really changed America, that really is the most important constitutional moment of the 20th century. But I think for the 60th anniversary, we also see it more as a challenge, right, which is, you know, embedded in the question that you asked, right, which is what are the most important issues that really confront African Americans, and particularly marginalized poor African Americans today, that we ought to be engaged with. I think the principal areas that we probably have to be focused on are 1, criminal justice, 2, education, and 3, voting rights. Criminal justice, of course, because just dealing with the mass incarceration issue, dealing with the fact that the United States has nearly 2 million people incarcerated, the vast majority of whom are Black and Latino, the vast rise in the incarcerated population that's happened over the last 30 years is largely as a result of laws that have resulted in the incarceration of nonviolent drug offenders. And people need to understand what this means, that every individual who is incarcerated, and these are mostly men but also women, are connected to a family and a community. And when we have taken and drawn these individuals out of their families and their communities and placed them in prison and removed them from that environment, we're essentially impoverishing their families and their communities. These overly long sentences, then the people emerge from prison without skills, without a real opportunity for jobs and so forth. The effect on our communities is really devastating. Then you take issues like, frankly, just violence against African Americans, whether it's the Trayvon Martin case or the Michael Dunn case, and the proliferation of stand your ground laws that now exist in 33 states.
Wow.
I think people think like, maybe it was just Florida. It's not an aberration. Actually, a majority of states have stand your ground laws. And these laws essentially are articulating something to the public about the way in which your subjective fear, your subjective sense of threat entitles you to use deadly force. And if you marry that with the reality of how people respond to Black people, right, how Black people are perceived in the media, that threat then can be operationalized into violent action. So that's just on the criminal justice front. But did you want to ask?
Well, because I thought we were going to get to this later, but I think we should actually just talk about it right now.
Okay.
Then, can you talk a bit about about LDF's strategy in terms of stand your ground laws?
Well, one of the challenges of stand your ground, of course, is I just said 33 states, and it's different in every state.
Oh, wow.
Right. So, you have to respond to the particular law that exists in a particular state, and then you have to think through a strategy for that state.
So can I stop you just for those of us whose parents were disappointed we didn't actually get our law degrees, and I have parents like that. Can you explain to us why this is not an issue that could sort of be addressed like Brown v. Board of Education, where you just take it to the Supreme Court and it gets resolved?
Well, you know what? Even Brown v. Board of Education had this challenge, right, which is there are certain issues that are principally governed by state law. Education is one of them. Criminal law is one of them. Marriage is one of them, right? Okay. So we have a federal constitution that guarantees certain rights, right? So even a state law that cannot violate the federal constitution. And that's why your state laws have to comply with, the constitutional right against certain kinds of searches and seizures, for example, or the right to have an impartial jury, or the right to have a jury that was not selected using racial bias. Those are federal laws, and state laws have to comply with them. And the question for the stand your ground laws in all their different iterations in 33 states is whether we can make a case about those laws violating the federal constitution. And that may vary from state to state. Okay. And then the strategy you have to think about is, are you trying to develop a collective strategy that would encompass several stand your ground laws from several states? Is there an essence from each of these laws that you contend violates the federal constitution? Or do you want to just try in one state, right, to workshop a case all the way up?
So what's the LDF strategy?
So the strategy, without giving away the strategy, is precisely to engage those questions. Is the best that I can tell you at this point, is to closely examine what are the vulnerable stand your ground laws, and what are the stand your ground laws that are most likely to be vulnerable to being found to violate the federal constitution, and developing a strategy to deal with those. But in the meantime, we've got the reality of young African Americans who are being shot and killed. And so the other strategy, frankly, is to figure out in these cases where you have these prosecutions, figuring out how we can infuse into those prosecutions some of the data and evidence that demonstrates how racial bias is motivating the ability of these individuals to believe that they can shoot and kill these young African Americans. So we could talk about criminal justice forever, but that's one. Education, I think, is one that everyone knows is deeply problematic. And this is a long story that really comes from Brown, and really comes from the effort to try and obtain quality education for African American children. The reality is that what happened after Brown is a legacy that we're still living with. the decision of the Supreme Court in the second Brown case to give Southern states time to work out how they were going to desegregate essentially gave Southern states time to decide that they weren't going to desegregate. And you've probably heard of massive resistance. That was the effort of Southern states to resist Brown at all costs. And they did, and they really did. And frankly, by the time the apparatus was in place to force Southern jurisdictions to desegregate, which really came with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this year's the 50th anniversary of that act, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave black voters the opportunity to hold elected officials to account in the South, essentially much of the power of Brown had been dissipated by massive resistance. And so we're dealing with that today. So today the real questions are how today, in a society which has largely become resegregated, right, where white flight to the suburbs and so forth has left certainly urban school districts majority black in most of the country, how do we deal with the issues of quality education? So that's the second issue, and I could go on about that too. And then the third issue, of course, is voting rights. You know that the Supreme Court decided last year in the Shelby County, Alabama case to essentially remove one of the most important protections, voting protections, from the Voting Rights Act. The result since that time has been really a retrenchment in jurisdictions all over this country. And that's also a critical issue that I think is on the table for us this year.
So I want to go back to education, especially since it's the 60th anniversary of Brown. You know, the goal of Brown, at least as I understand it, without my law degree, was really to achieve educational equality, right? I mean, that was the goal. And yet we all know that our country seems to still have quite a ways to go in achieving that goal. So I guess my first question would be, what do you think Thurgood Marshall, Constance Motley, all of the great legal eagles who worked to help us achieve the success with Brown, think of where things are today in terms of educational equality in this country?
So the first thing I would say is that, and I want to get to the education point in a second, but the Brown case is actually not just about education. The Brown case really, I described it as kind of the most important constitutional moment of the 20th century because the Brown case really hits the reset button in terms of equality, justice, and articulating who we are as a country. We'd had a civil war in the 1800s, you know, we'd had Reconstruction, and then we had post-Reconstruction. And the promise of the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, were essentially put on hold for African Americans. And what the Brown case did was it articulated the equal citizenship of black people in this country. And I really think it's important for people to understand it's not just a case about education. It is a case that allows you and I to sit at this table where we're sitting today, in this building where we're sitting today, because it articulates the humanity and the equal citizenship of black people in this country.
Gosh, I hope someone out there tweeted that, since I can't tweet in the middle, because that needs to be...
And it's from that moment that all the rest of it happens, right? And so one of the things that, you know, we've been talking about with the 60th anniversary of Brown this year is helping people understand that piece. So about that, I think that Thurgood Marshall and all of the lawyers who worked on Brown, Jack Greenberg and so forth, would actually be very pleased. Because the reality is Brown did begin the end of legal apartheid in this country. And that is, you know, frankly, really the watershed constitutional moment that brings us into the 21st century. Brown is about education because those lawyers believed that access to equal education in this country would open the doors of opportunity to African Americans and allow African Americans to change the material condition of their lives. So we should remember it's not, you know, it is about education, but it's about education because of what we believed education would do.
Right. So it's, in other words, it's not about schools. It is about...
It's operational. That's right. So, so that's important too. What I think Marshall and the team probably could not have anticipated, and this is one of what I think of as kind of the tragic outcomes of Brown, was that there were some in this country, too many, unfortunately, who were willing to essentially destroy our public education system rather than share it with black children. And in many ways, they were successful. And what we are left with today is a public education system that's deeply impoverished financially, but that also many people have withdrawn their psychological support from. Wow. So the most important thing for us, I think, to think about is, as Americans, are we prepared to re-engage the public education system, which is the principal means, notwithstanding charters and private schools and all the other ways that people can educate children, which is a wonderful thing, right? But if, in fact, we believe what Brown said, and what Chief Justice Marshall said in Brown, was that today, education is the principal means of becoming a good citizen and of achieving success in our society. If that was true in 1954, it's no less true today. That being true, what are we prepared to commit as Americans to that? So there are issues of funding and resources, issues of training, issues of access to quality education in all of its components, including labs and computers and certified teachers and all of the components that provide that quality education. So there's a part of it that's micro, working with particular school districts to make that happen. And then there's a part of it that's macro, which is transforming the conversation about we as Americans and our commitment to public education. If, in fact, it is the principal marker of citizenship and success that Chief Justice Marshall identified, then we have to question ourselves if we are anything but 100% committed to that.
What's that famous saying? Someone, and I'm blanking on who it is, hopefully someone out there will recall, but someone said something like, if every American, wealthy or poor, didn't have a say-so in which school their child would be going to, but it was simply the luck of the draw, then the entire attitude and conversation about race, about education in this country would change across racial lines, across class lines. Well, actually, so speaking of sort of the issue of class, and as well as the issue of race, we live in a country in which we now have an African-American president. And I think it's worth noting for the context of this question, who's someone who's actually the product of a mixed-race family. And mixed-race families are the fastest-growing demographic in this country. So that says that obviously we have made some progress, right, on the issue of civil rights and race. On the other hand, poll after poll after poll, particularly the last couple of years, have shown that there seems to be a racial divide on how people view civil rights issues, with, for instance, white Americans less likely to support affirmative action programs than other groups, and yet they're also significantly more likely to support stand your ground laws compared to African Americans. Are you surprised that 60 years after such a landmark civil rights case, we're still here? That we're still having
I'm dismayed.
I see it one way and you see it another.
I'm not surprised. I'm dismayed. I think that truthfully, most people, I'm a civil rights professional, so I talk about race all the time and I engage the question of race all the time. But I think if we're truthful with ourselves, most people in this country do not engage the question of race in a way that allows them to change their minds, to add to their knowledge, to transform their views. The reality of the way we live is that people feel like they're having conversations about race all the time because of some of the things you talked about, because people are more likely now to have a person of another race in their family, because you watch television, and I think there's a scholar, I think her name is, I'm trying to remember what her name is, Barbara Diggs, who calls it virtual integration. We watch TV, and so we feel like we're having these integrated experiences.
So it's not just I have a black friend, it's I have a black friend on TV.
Exactly, and they feel like my neighbor. And so people feel like they're engaged. I think people just watching the president, walk up to the podium.
Or voting for him.
Or voting for him, feel like they're in a conversation on race. But, or that they're engaging the question. And they are somewhat, but really to engage the issues that make us uncomfortable, right? The issues about which we're not sure, whether it's affirmative action or whether it's stand your ground or whether it's any number of issues, I think is something that people are mostly not engaged in. And so it doesn't entirely surprise me that therefore there is kind of this, there continues to be this divide. And the question is, and it goes back to your first question about, what the media focuses on and what we focus on, frankly, when we begin to talk about race.
So would it be fair to say, for instance, that people are having in-depth conversations about Paula Deen and think that they're having a really substantive conversation about race, but they've probably never had a substantive conversation with anyone of a different race about affirmative action.
That's exactly right.
So
that's exactly, and thus the exhaustion. People feel like with God we're talking about race all the time.
Right, but we're not talking about the right things.
We're not talking about the substantive issues that are important. We're doing pop race.
That's interesting. And if you haven't copyrighted that term, you should, because you might see it pop up in one of my columns very soon.
Okay, all right, get my lawyers on it right away.
No, I'm not fooling with you. This is a lawyer I will not be fooling with. So, actually, to that point, so this week Attorney General Eric Holder said the following in a speech. However well-intentioned current advocates of felony disenfranchisement may be, the reality is that these measures are, at best, profoundly outdated. At worst, these laws, with their disparate impact on minority communities, echo policies enacted during a deeply troubled period in America's past, a time of post-Civil War discrimination, and they have their roots in centuries-old conceptions of justice that were too often based on exclusion, animus, and fear. So he's talking about really restoring the voting rights of convicted felons as a civil rights issue and framing it that way. And I definitely saw critics online who said, you know, I am someone who is more progressive on certain social issues, but I really have a problem with this being framed as a civil rights or racial issue. I read a couple comments that were critical of that. But what did you make of the remarks?
Well, I couldn't have been more thrilled with the Attorney General's remarks, and frankly, he's been on a roll lately with just some really critically important issues around criminal justice. And I just told you that most of our kind of criminal justice system operates at the state level. So understand, even when he makes these comments, he is using the bully pulpit of being Attorney General to suggest, you know, what is problematic about laws that disenfranchise ex-offenders, even though he can't change the state laws himself. So, but he is absolutely right, and I think many people don't realize the power of these laws to disenfranchise African Americans. If you marry it to the first part of our conversation about the incarcerated population, the mass incarceration, a majority of whom are black and brown, and then you go into states that have laws that don't allow ex-offenders to vote, you have states like Alabama where it's estimated that 13% of black men in that state are unable to vote because of their law denying ex-offenders the right to vote.
And with the size of that population, I mean, theoretically, that's something that could swing a presidential election.
It's a huge amount of people that we're talking about. Now, the reason why it's important is to, you know, like stop and pause, right? The mark of citizenship is your ability to vote, right? That's what you get, you know, as a citizen of this country. Now, if you've committed a crime and you've served the time for the crime, and therefore you have paid your debt to society, and you are now released from prison, to continue to deny you the mark of citizenship, right, is essentially to extend your sentence into a lifetime sentence, and in the worst kind of way. These are people that we want to be reintegrated into society and to live responsible lives, and yet we deny them the very thing that marks you as a responsible citizen and member of society. So I've been really pleased that in a number of states there have been some reversals. Maryland is a state, I worked on this for many years, that had an ex-felon disenfranchisement law and then changed that law. But there are a number of states in the Deep South that have these laws. And I think Attorney General Holder is absolutely right that it is a civil rights issue, and that it is a civil rights issue that really many people in those states need to return to as a bedrock issue.
Well, I have to say my favorite part about this is when I was looking up the remarks. I think he delivered them in a speech in Virginia.
That's right.
And so, of course, my favorite part is one of the articles that wrote about the remarks closed by saying that the state's governor is facing felony charges. so who is not black, by the way.
Well, you know what's interesting? What was interesting was after his remarks, the governor of Alabama said, you know, I'd be willing to look at that.
That's really fascinating.
But that was amazing. So you can imagine the rush, you know, of many of us to Alabama to try and capitalize on that.
Right.
But you know, it may be that we're at a moment that people recognize, and the history that Attorney General Holder cites is absolutely accurate. Many of these laws were enacted in that post-Reconstruction period, right, precisely to disenfranchise African Americans.
Can you stop and explain that really quickly for people who don't know?
So first of all, let me just lay out why many believe that these laws are constitutional. The 14th Amendment, which is the amendment that includes the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause, also includes a clause in it that was targeted at southern states who were going to re-enter the Union. And basically it included in it a clause that was meant to set up a punishment system for those states. And it said that you have to let men, because at that point women couldn't vote, over the age of 21 vote, or if you don't let them vote, we're going to reduce the number of representatives that you get in Congress. And it said the only reasons that we wouldn't punish you this way is if you didn't let people vote who had committed some kind of crime, right? And so many people believe, therefore, that the Constitution allows states to disenfranchise ex-offenders. Now, the actual language that's used in the 14th Amendment suggests that they did not mean garden variety crime, that they meant really rebellion. That issue has been litigated, and LDF litigated several of those cases in the Court of Appeals, and we haven't been successful in that yet. But the beginning of those laws really came in the post-Reconstruction period, particularly in Alabama, where the effort was to disenfranchise African-American men. And so the kinds of things that were felonies that could result in your disenfranchisement were a series of laws that were enacted that they thought African Americans were more likely to be convicted of. And so there was pig stealing and vagrancy and other kinds of laws.
Translation, my family's starving and I might need...
Exactly. And so so Attorney General Holder is quite right that the genesis of many of these laws came from a deliberate effort to disenfranchise African American men.
So this is like a history lesson. I appreciate it. No, seriously, I feel like I may have never made it to law school, but I'm getting the crash course in constitutional law from you, and I appreciate it. So we talked a little bit earlier about pop race, and so I'm going to be guilty of playing into that because I am going to ask you a question about a pop race conversation that sort of took place this week. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas was in the news. I can see how excited you are for this question already. Was in the news earlier this week for some remarks that he made, and I mean he made several, but the ones that seemed to sort of have generated the most attention is he seemed to sort of convey this sense that people talked a lot less about race, quote, back in his day, I guess would be the way to explain it, growing up in Georgia. Now I have to say, both of my parents grew up in the segregated South, and they don't paint a particularly rosy picture of what things were like back when it was segregated and they went to subpar schools and all those sorts of things. So, you know, he basically seemed to be making the case that people are too overly sensitive about racial issues today and were less so back then. What did you make of those remarks, aside from the fact that I'm sure you think that this is too much, they generate too much media coverage, besides that?
Yes. He did say that he thought that people are today too sensitive about race. It was when I read the comments, it was precisely during the time that CNN was covering the trial of Michael Dunn, who's accused of killing young Jordan Davis, an African-American young man who was in a car with his friends playing loud music at a gas station. And he was, Michael Dunn is a white man who was with his, I think, wife, and drew his gun. He got into some conversation about wanting these young people to turn their music down.
At the gas station he did not own.
At the gas station he did not own, and claims that he thought he saw a gun. There was no gun or weapon in the car with the young teenagers, and he fired many shots into the car. He killed Jordan Davis, and then he drove off and went to a hotel for the night and so forth. And so when I read these comments, it was precisely at the time that that trial was unfolding and Mr. Dunn was testifying about how he felt threatened by this young man. And I don't really know what to say, except that everyone is entitled to their memories of the past. Everyone's entitled to create a past that works for them. But there are also facts. And to paint a picture of segregated Georgia, as though this was a time that was rosier than the time we live in now, I think is just contrary to the facts. And I also think that the idea that people are just hypersensitive about race also plays into a really unfortunate narrative that I think some people are invested in, which is the idea that those of us who care about racial equality and who work for racial equality are causing the problem.
And who talk about it.
And who talk about it are causing the problem. Not racism, right? Not racial inequality, not inequity, but those of us who engage it. And so at this precise moment when we were dealing with this, trial involving the death of this young man, the comments just struck me as odd, and for that reason I chose not to engage them, because I do think I want to engage the reality of race that's happening at this moment, and not, a kind of editorialized view about race that I think, is contrary to the facts.
Well, something I've actually written before, I guess I'm going to turn around and answer my own question here about my thoughts on
yes,
his
please.
comments, which is, I've written about this before, but the sense that, to me, sort of how some people tiptoe around race, it would to me be like if, your doctor says you have cancer, we want to treat it, and you say, how dare you bring up such a negative
yes.
thought. I
You're
was
such
fine,
a downer.
You're such a downer. Why did you tell me I have this cancer that we need to work on? And the last thing I also think is really important to say in the context of his comments, because I don't have the exact quote. Actually, I do have the quote some here, but it's okay. That just because something is not being spoken of, sort of like the cancer analogy, doesn't mean it exists. It often means that the people who have the most to say on it don't have a voice in the circumstance.
Well, it could mean, it could mean two
the
things.
idea that he wasn't hearing a lot of substantive engagement of conversation around him in the particular place in Georgia where he was from does not mean that's because the black Americans disenfranchised there did not have a lot to say.
Right.
And that, to me, is the other thing that
That's
I really have a problem with that.
I think you're spot on, that those who are most invested, who have the most to lose, may not have a voice. I also think that those who are least invested have no particular interest in having the conversation, right? And I think that, we have to resist the seduction of the easy bromide and the easy, mathematical equation on race. You'll remember that it was Chief Justice Roberts who said in a case in 2006, the only way to stop discrimination based on race is to stop discriminating based on race, right? So, oh wow! I wish we had thought of that.
Right.
So I think that that many people feel like if we just didn't talk about it,
it'll go away.
I think the people who feel this way about marriage equality, about all kinds of issues, if we just didn't talk about it, maybe it would go away, and then I wouldn't feel uncomfortable anymore. And I understand people's discomfort, and I actually do try and feel the need to engage people across that discomfort and to try to help people understand that there are ways to talk about race without blowing up the room. There are ways that we can do it. But I do think that, like color blindness, right?
A term I hate.
The idea that we don't talk about race is simply a way of masking, of suppressing, of covering over, what are continuous and very real racial disparities in our society.
We're about to open it up to questions, but I just want to say too, I try to remind people whenever they use the term colorblind, often as a positive. They'll say to me, Keli, I was raised to be colorblind, and I try to remind people that very rarely have I ever heard a minority use the term colorblind or embrace it or celebrate in a positive sense, because oftentimes when a company, a corporation, an institution, an entity uses the term colorblind, we tend to disappear. The color tends to disappear from the rooms or from the institution. And what I try to remind people is, I don't want you to not see my color.
That's right.
I want you to be able to see my color and for me to see yours, and for it to not work against us.
That's right.
We should be able to embrace each
said.
other, regardless of our differences, not ignore those differences. And that's, I think, the society we want to get to. So what can people out there do to help?
So, I want to be very clear that, so we're civil rights lawyers, and we always have a goal in mind. And I'm a big believer in winning. And, while we recognize that the struggle for racial justice is ongoing, we have to win some things. And that means that people have to be active and have to be engaged. Even though we're in the courtroom, what is happening in the larger society and the kind of pressure that people feel to engage questions really comes from people who are out in America who are engaging in, addressing some of the issues that we're focused on. So in the area of voting rights, for example, Congress has actually introduced a bill to deal with the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby case last year.
Sidebar, were you surprised by the Shelby decision?
Not after being at the oral argument.
Okay. I knew I couldn't ask you that before.
No. I can't say I wasn't. We began preparing for it before the decision because we pretty much thought we saw which way it was going after the argument in last February. So, I think people need to, first of all, learn about the bill, go on our website and learn about the bill.
Plug the website again.
www.naacpldf.org. And also they need to engage with their congresspersons. You know, you need to call your congressperson and tell them you do think that there needs to be a fix to the Voting Rights Act, that you do need states and jurisdictions to make sure that they protect minority voters. Remember, what we lost in the provision of the Voting Rights Act that was struck down by the Supreme Court was, number one, we lost the early warning system to find out about voting changes that are going to discriminate against minorities. We put the burden back on minority communities and groups like ours to have to sue rather than to have a kind of administrative process that would make sure minority voters are protected. So you need to do that. And you need to really engage with your congressperson about what you want to see them do over the next, and I mean this, few weeks on this voting rights bill. We're coming up on our Selma weekend, March 7th to 9th. We all go down to Alabama to commemorate the anniversary of the Selma March, and that's an important moment of mobilization. Congressman John Lewis always goes, and he's tremendously inspirational.
Wow.
And so anyone can come, and I hope that you will come.
And that you will swing by the governor's office and
and
talk
that
to
you
him
will
about
swing, that you'll swing by the governor's
felony
office.
voting rights.
Absolutely. We're continuing to push on a variety of criminal justice issues, including you know, this continuing disparity between those who are convicted of using powder cocaine and those who are convicted of crimes involving crack cocaine. LDF has been involved in the litigation in those cases, and there are 9,000 people who are still in prison under the old laws, which had a disparity of 100 to 1.
Wow.
In other words, if you would have a longer sentence, 100 times that of the sentence of someone using powder cocaine. There are 9,000 people still in prison under that old law. 90% of them are African American. Although Congress passed a new law that, you know, changes that disparity, that law hasn't been applied retroactively, so those people are still in prison.
Wow.
So there are lots of issues for you to engage in. We try to, on our website, provide all of the information that you need to get in where, you know, you have your greatest interests. In the educational field around school discipline issues and pushing kids out of school, lots for you to do. So I really do hope you'll visit the website, that you'll follow LDF on Twitter. The most important thing for you to do is to stay informed because every week new things are happening and we need your help.
So I think we're going to...
Question? Oh, yes.
Questions.
Okay, I'll give that to you.
Okay. So, this is great. With all the talk about us being in a post-racial society, how do we engage younger people who are growing up in a very different America than the ones that had some of the struggles we've talked about a lot here today? How do we get them motivated and fired up?
Yeah, the most important thing, I think, is to give young people, I wouldn't even say give it because they have it, listen to young people's voice. It's one of the reasons why I'm so enamored of this group, the Dream Defenders in Florida, a group of young people who really began to become active after the verdict in the George Zimmerman case, the man who killed Trayvon Martin. And actually we sent an LDF lawyer down to meet with them very early on and just to listen to what they're trying to do. They have a whole manifesto called Trayvon's Law in which they're trying to engage many of these issues as well, including Florida's Stand Your Ground law. And so continuing to meet with and talk with young people, bringing them into the work that we're doing. We're on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. You can follow me. We really are trying to engage in social media. We keep a very active Facebook page. And then just listening. We have one of our education lawyers who's going up to Michigan to really just sit with students at the University of Michigan who are having like an all-night event to talk about discrimination at that school. And so for us, we work on, affirmative action issues at universities, the listening to young people. We represent black students at University of Texas who, are still focused on affirmative action issues there. We represent black children in Texas who've been subjected to, school police actions that give them criminal tickets for using profanity. So a lot of our work actually is focused on young people and particularly focused on students. And representing students and representing young people is a key way of making sure that their voice is amplified on civil rights so that when we're in the courtroom, their voice is really heard.
Although I'm really curious, I have to say, Sherrilyn, to see, and I don't know that it's too soon to have done research on this. I am someone who, has written a lot about the impact of generational differences on younger people of color, the hip-hop generation, the post-civil rights generation, millennials, whatever you want to call them, and how different our perspective on race
Yeah.
and politics is from our parents. I mean, my parents, like I said, grew up in the segregated South with colored and versus white water fountains. And yet, I am very curious to see the long-term impact of Trayvon Martin's death on this generation. I think a lot of people assumed that race would become, and the research showed that race was kind of becoming a secondary or third issue where people thought, I don't really have to think about it.
That's
and
right.
now I have certainly sensed, particularly among younger black men, this idea that everywhere you go, you have to think about it.
I think that last year was really a watershed moment for the early 20th century in helping people understand where we are on race and where we are not. Right. I think the Supreme Court's decision and all of the voter suppression activities that have been happening in states, I think Trayvon Martin's killing and the acquittal of George Zimmerman, and then the subsequent, killing of Renisha McBride and Jordan Davis and other young people, I think has really made young people pay attention. And remember, they're living under tremendous pressure too. The pressure to be able to afford college. What happened with the student loans last year, the Parent Plus loans that really put pressure on students who could not return to school is really powerful. The ongoing impact of the job market and the inability of young people to get jobs that will allow them to live independent lives is really opening their eyes to the way in which the policies and the practices that have engaged and occupied those from my generation really are on the table for them. And what's exciting to see is them coming with their own voice, their own style, their own way of engaging these issues, and their willingness to really put themselves on the line, to be on the front line. So I've been incredibly encouraged by what I see as the engagement and activism of young people on these issues.
And I guess last question, this is a good one. What's the biggest challenge your organization faces? A little tiny simple question to close things out.
No, it's not one.
Big.
It's not one.
Yeah.
Well, I think there are multiple challenges. They're the challenges of resources, right? So, if you even just look at the Voting Rights Act case and what happened last year, once the Supreme Court removes this protection that had been in place for 48 years, we start hearing in towns all over the South that they're moving polling places, that they're engaging in all this activity. So we've got to send our lawyers down, and we're putting out fires. It's almost like whack-a-mole. So just the expense, frankly, in time and financially of being able to meet the challenges that we face, is huge. The challenge of communication, that's part of why we're doing this today, like just keeping people informed of what's going on. But then I think the most important challenge, at least for me, is being able to strategically respond to the moment that we're in, being able to pivot, being able to recognize when we're doing something that works and when we're doing something that doesn't work, and ensuring that our organization is nimble enough to respond to what's happening in the moment, to have our game for the long haul, but also to be able to respond to what's happening in the moment. And as you and I were just discussing, so much has been happening that really resonates with us as a community that we just have to be able to be responsive to what's happening in the moment as well.
So can you, I just think on a final note, let people know, because we haven't talked much about this, how they can help in terms of, you were saying it's really expensive to finance things. I think sometimes when it comes for organizations like this, people think that they can only, if they can't host a fundraiser in their home or they can't do something like that, they can't make a difference. So can you talk a little bit about
what this note just actually came from someone on our staff, and it was saying I should remind everyone to really support LDF.
Perfect. Okay.
But there are lots of ways to support us. One is we do want you to come to our website and just look at what we're doing and make it something that you do regularly, that we try to put new information up all the time so that you can stay informed. Obviously, you can support us financially. You can go to, again, our website, www.naacpldf.org, and you can go to the Support Us button and see how you can support us at any level, which would be fantastic. And then you can also communicate with us. It's really important. I love getting emails and letters from people that say, did you know about this? Did you know what's happening in this school district? Because believe it or not, a lot of our work, our litigation, comes from people reaching out to us and saying, did you know this was happening? Wow. And then we go out and investigate and we discover, hey, this is something we really want to work on. So we really do need to hear from you. And the other thing we actually like to hear suggestions about what we should be doing, about how to do the work, about how to communicate about the cases that we're involved in. We communicate a lot with lawyers out in the field that we call cooperating attorneys, lawyers all over the South who are solo practitioners or work in small law offices who are our partners, our civil rights partners, and we love hearing from them as well. So really it's communication, financial support, following us, on social media, and most of all, staying engaged in your community with civil rights issues, and making sure that your voice is heard, because you're our feet. We can't be everywhere. And so just, I hope people will continue to just stay engaged and support us.
So I think the takeaway is if you have not already purchased a Valentine's Day gift for the person you love, such as flowers or whatnot, then I'm sure they'd love a donation in their name to the NAACP
I hadn't thought
Legal
of that.
Defense Fund. And this is your opportunity before Valentine's Day is over to go ahead and make that happen. So I think
Thank you so much, Keli. I so appreciate it. This was fantastic.
Thank you for the history lesson. I learned a lot, and I hopefully my family will be proud that even though I never made it to law school, I got to sit with one of the premier civil rights lawyers in the land. So
thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. I so appreciate it, and you will see us again. We'll have another webinar soon. We'll send out that information, but I really appreciate your being with us for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope we'll hear from you soon. Thanks again to Keli Goff and all the folks here at Stratosphere for putting this together, and all the best to you. Take care.